Yeah, so my name's Stuart Mobsby. I'm a nurse practitioner currently working with NT Health in Darwin Correctional Centre. I've been given this topic to talk about assessing readiness and motivation for change. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people as the First Nations people of this country. Pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people calling in today. And finally, I just would like to acknowledge the Aboriginal health practitioners, the Aboriginal health workers, Aboriginal community workers who have really supported my journey working in Top End. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the community members who have worked as educators and mentors whilst I was working on their land. I don't believe I would have got where I am today without their guidance and assistance. So today, when I was first asked to present this presentation, I was a bit kind of like, oh, I'm not really sure I know what to do. So I've kind of just reflected back on my experience of working in remote communities here in the Top End. At that time, most of a real core part of my work has been working with people with chronic conditions. And I've had experience of working with young people with type 2 diabetes. And some of this has been my what I've learned through that process. As I've mentioned, a lot of my roles focus on the chronic conditions management across the lifespan, really, but really heavily focused on supporting self-management strategies within remote communities. So I'll go through some of the considerations that come to mind when we're delivering services within remote communities. I'll talk a little bit about self-management support, what that is and why it's important. I'll also talk about some of the steps that I go through and consider in terms of delivering self-management. And then also I'll have a case study of an action plan. So some of the challenges that I think are really important in delivering services in some of the environments some of the communities where I've worked have been really poor resource. And I mean that in terms of limited health staff, sometimes just visiting communities, visiting services, and that could include visiting doctors. Often a high turnover of staff as well. But one of the challenges I want to put forward, even though we live in resource poor environments, there are a lot of resources within communities that we should be accessing. And these could be other organisations, but also the community themselves as well. The other challenge is often the model of care. We often see acute-based care being delivered predominantly, whereas if we're delivering chronic conditions management, whether it's a chronic conditions management model or preventative models, but often what we see is this acute approach to care with a lot of our clients. The cultural context is often, I think, challenging for both non-Aboriginal health staff, but I think also for the community as well. So having non-Aboriginal health staff delivering care. Cultural context often, there's challenges around health beliefs and about where that care is delivered. So even, down to a determination of what is health, I think is often mixed up as well. The last thing just to consider with our youth diabetes is we're dealing with children, adolescents, and young adults. And so if we're delivering chronic disease care, is that the same for an adult as you would for a child? Now, we do have other kids with chronic conditions, you know, kids with type 1 diabetes, asthma, but type 2 diabetes really is seen as an older person's disease. And what are the approaches the same, or is there need to be a different approach need to be taken? The other thing that I just often think about, and this is quite an old reference, but from Corbin and Strauss, who talk about 3 lines of work in managing chronic conditions. And I think where this comes from is I often hear that, you know, I have heard quite a lot, health is not the priority. There's always other things that are more important. Well, I would challenge that nobody wants poor health. And really, to understand what's happening for an individual, we all try and maintain a sense of balance within our life. If you throw a chronic condition in there in the mix as well, there's changes that will happen at all of these levels. So I'm really interested in this biographical work, the impacts on identity. You know, how does having a chronic condition affect your identity? Are you then being seen as the sick person? Are you seen different? How does it affect your roles within your family, but within your community? And I think this is complex even for an adult, but when we start to think about children, adolescents, and young people, often they are developing their ideas of self and who they are. And so this can often cause quite a few problems. Everyday work, again, it's just, you know, the things that people have to do to maintain normal life. So they're always working to keep that normal sense of life. And then illness work we'll talk about a bit more. So self-management. Really, I'm very passionate about self-management. It's a critical component of chronic conditions management. The reason why it's so important is that we can see that the majority of the care that is actually undertaken for the management of chronic conditions is actually undertaken by the individual themselves or their family. And a lot of the illness work that we want people to do, we want people to eat well, exercise, take their medicines, keep a good mental health, watch out for changes within their condition and within themselves, how to cope if their symptoms deteriorate, and to know when to come to us as health professionals. The way to really consider this that the individuals are a really important part of our team who play a huge role within that care. I've just popped this one definition of self-management within here. Now there's lots of definitions out there, and the reason I thought this one, what this highlighted was the outcome. So the outcome isn't always going to be the perfect blood sugar or the perfect HbA1c. The outcomes are actually, for the individual, is about having an active and emotionally satisfying life in the face of having a chronic condition. So when we're measuring these outcomes, we actually have to take a stance of what is it for the individual? What is it the outcome that we're hoping for? And this is what we need to work for. And I'll show some examples a bit later on. So self-management support. This is what we do as health professionals. As has been mentioned, I think quite strongly throughout this webinar series, is this development of a collaborative and active partnership or engagement. Way that I see collaborative and what collaborative really means is about sharing. So it's about sharing the journey, And as much as we can, it's about sharing the power. So sharing the decision-making with the client, and their family as well. Person-centered care approach. So it's not about the health professional making all the decisions about what is important or what they should achieve. It's about what the individual and the family believe, what they feel is important in terms of their care, and what their goals and their outcomes. And really, the only way we can do that is through talking and listening to the individual about what's important. Once we have good collaboration and active partnerships, and as we're focusing on person-centered or person and family-centered care, we also then have that shared responsibility for the outcomes. So we are sharing what you're working towards. We're not going to have different goals. You have that agreement between the individual, the family, and the clinician. Self-management support has a strong focus on empowerment and building capacity. And I'll talk a little bit more about this a bit further on, but really it's about building that strength within the individual and their family to deliver care. And the last thing is just about, this is lifelong and ongoing approach. This is not quick, simple fixes. This is about taking the time to understand the individual and working together on a shared approach. And to recognize that things change over time, goals, outcomes, the individual's perspective may change. So as the health professional, our role is not to make all the plans and decide what's important. It's to act more like a facilitator or a guide. And the way that I think about a guide is we're not determining everything. We're not making the plans. We're not instructing. We're actually just listening to the individual, understanding what's important. We may throw some suggestions in there, which is really important from our experience about what has worked with other people, and guide people along that. So how does this work in terms of young people? Often, we will be, working more with families, but we still need to be ensuring, I think, any age, that we're listening to the client about what's important to them, regardless of their age. So I just want to talk about some of the steps or some of the processes that I go through in terms of when I'm thinking about self-management. And these are kind of the 4 terms that I often think about. I often think about capacity. Certainly in the prison space, we have a number of people with mental health problems, with type 2 diabetes, also some brain injuries and things like that. But one of the things I think is really important to consider, like, capacity isn't binary. It's not just one yes or no, someone has capacity. It exists along a gradient. And one thing I would say is that everyone has some capacity to to be involved and managing components of their care. So I think the youngest person I've looked after with type 2 diabetes was someone that was just before the age of 5, and certainly she had capacity to do things like her own blood sugars. So she was doing all those things. But as someone gets older, and it changes through that developmental stages, that into adolescent, the capacity may increase and may decrease. But as people go into young adults, their capacity usually will increase as well. The capacity is also considered in terms of the family situation, what's happening in the family, what family can do to support. And so it's not just the individual, but the family as well. Motivation. So of this presentation is about motivation, but motivation just really doesn't exist on its own. Motivation does exist with all these other components. It's the why of why someone would be changing behaviours or taking on self-management strategies. I often think about what's intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Obviously, that internal thought processes tend to last longer and have much more relevance to the individual themselves. If we're applying external motivation, they probably only exist while you still continue to provide that external motivation. So we do need to be careful that, you know, we're not just motivating externally, but kind of facilitating those discussions for the individual to consider internally why they would want to improve, develop management strategies. I always include self-efficacy or confidence. It's something I think I see more and more in terms of people have capacity to look after themselves or to take on strategies. They're very motivated so that they really believe, you know, everything they need to do, but they just no confidence in themselves to take on certain aspects of the care. The last thing I'm always thinking about is the opportunity. And I think this is a really important space for us as health professionals to really consider. I think it's been highlighted quite a lot through this webinar series that, you know, especially with young people, we need to provide the opportunity to be to have care for their conditions. We need to consider, there's a couple of things we need to consider. Is it the right service? And also, is it the right people as well delivering that service? So, you know, is the health centre the best place to deliver care for young people? Do we need to consider other resources out within our communities where we can engage with our community or with young people? I know some of the work Angela has done with Headspace and finding a place where young people feel comfortable. The other thing is just to find the right people as well. I suppose one of the considerations that I've thought about with a young woman that I was involved in with her care, although I had a lot of experience in chronic conditions management and strong focus in self-management, considering a slightly older man may not be the most appropriate person. So some of my role was about skilling up an Aboriginal health worker who was probably close to her age. So we do need to think about the service, but also the right people to deliver services as well. I'll just mention about this is my step process. So this comes from a motivational interviewing approach, and it's really important to understand it is a step approach. So if you don't have good engagement, you're not going to be able to focus on the issues that we need to focus on. And certainly you won't be able to go further up the steps. So often we do see an engagement of, hello, how are you doing? And then what we can see is people stepping straight into that planning phase. It really just doesn't work. The focusing really does require active listening to both the client and the family. to really understand what is important and what their desired outcomes in terms of management. Evoking is really about strengthening the focus. So, and really is the kind of essence of motivational interviewing. So really understanding, okay, well, this is really important. And often you think about, you know, a desire, so things that they need, like they would hope for. You'd listen to things around what they feel they're able to do, like reasons, and people might hear people give reasons about why something's really important, or they might describe a need as well. So you can start to focus on, okay, well, tell me a little bit more about that. Why is that important? And then we can move towards planning. And again, planning is working together on a desired outcome. How does this look with youth? Obviously, that developmental kind of milestones of, as people get older, certainly into the sort of, you know, pre-teens to teens, you definitely can start asking these questions. But I think the approach still does work with younger kids, because you're asking them why stuff is important. Why is that important? And it's about strengthening why that is important. Some of the rules I think I keep with this is be curious, but not intrusive. So there is a fine balance about asking questions and being curious why something is important. But often if you're firing lots of questions, it can be a little bit intrusive. The other thing is never assume you know what it feels like, or you never assume something. But I will often use reflective. So it's this what you're meaning, just to kind of clarify and cement that idea. So from here, I do have a case study to kind of show that examples, but I don't know if we want to open this up to questions first, and then we can go to the case study.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. We'll go to questions first, and then we'll do the case study at the end. I'll leave 10 minutes for that, so I'll keep an eye on the time. I welcome Sean and Angela to join us for the question and answer. And for our participants, please start asking some questions, guys. What would you like us to discuss and talk about? I'll start with a question for Sean. Sean, I know your your doctorate focused on community level interventions to support people with their chronic disease management. I just wondered if you could comment a little bit about how that went, and also how that might work hand in hand with more individual levels of supporting individuals to make the changes that are important to them.
Yeah, thanks, Damien. I think most of the stuff that Stuart sort of articulated in his presentation, and one of the things that I looked at, I had 219 patients across the 5 regions in the Torres Strait, so Murray Island, Darnley, Stephen, York, and Saibai. And I provided the care at the time, and basically the same personalised care, giving people the information, because my honours degree looked at the association between health literacy and glycemic control, and I hypothesised that most of our patients had poor health literacy, which in the case, when I used the tool called the Test of Functional Health Literacy in Adults, it demonstrated that people were health literate. It was the education that we were giving to our patients. So it was the why behind the why. So why am I taking this medication? Why am I going to the clinic? Why am I going there? So I spent hours and hours with the patient, walking through them at an individual level, like Stuart said, focusing on, explaining to the patients in their home environment around their diabetes, their medication, the reason why you had to see the multidisciplinary team. We spoke about their GP management care plans, their team care arrangement care plans. So it took me about 2.5 months per community, working with all of these diabetics in the 5 regions, and then we had a control site. So I did the work as what Stuart was doing, but then I looked at it at a population level and compared it with the control side without somebody who wasn't dedicating their time in diabetes, because as Stuart mentioned in his presentation, it was the acute versus the chronic disease, and most of our clinicians in those remote and regional areas primarily focus on the acute.
Yeah, thanks, John. That's really interesting. I'm interested, what kind of results did you get with the control site versus the intervention sites that you were doing that?
Oh, Damien, now you're taking me back so basically, where we looked at the referrals, many of our clinicians weren't being referred. So we had the GP management care plan and the team care arrangement care plans, plus the adult health checks that we were doing as part of the chronic disease management and focusing on the diabetes. Whereas you had somebody who was dedicated in that position could follow the patient through. So with the control side, we saw that there was a reduction in the follow-up care of patients. And we also looked at the the psychological barriers to insulin therapy. So why patients were reluctant to start insulin therapy, and it was the way insulin was introduced into patients into their regime. So we tend to introduce insulin too late in the patient's journey, because we try to encourage people to do lifestyle behaviors first, or change lifestyle behaviors. Whereas if you have the conversation well and truly at the point to say, insulin therapy is a class treatment, at some point in your diabetes journey, you will commence insulin therapy. But you also got to remember that well-managed diabetes is the leading cause of nothing. You manage your diabetes quite well, you will have no complications. So that it was the change around the languages. So with somebody who was dedicated versus someone without, we saw referrals were not being made, patients were not being followed up. There was a significant decrease in the team care arrangements and the GP management care plans. And we saw the HbA1c was greater in those who didn't have someone dedicated to look after diabetes.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. One of the things that came out, I think, from what you're saying, Sean, and Stuart, your presentation, is that it's an intensive process. Behaviour change takes a lot of time and committed clinicians. I'm wondering, Stuart, how long oftentimes does it take you before you might start maybe making some progress with patients in terms of implementing some interventions that you might think start helping them clinically?
Yeah, how long's a piece of string, really? I suppose really thinking about this step, like engagement can be very quick and it can be very long. But really, if you don't have good engagement, you're not going to have the rest of it. So it's working on those strategies, building a connection, and really just, spending that time in that space, because once you've got a good working relationship, a good therapeutic relationship, certainly focusing can become much easier. Your suggestions are often, more accepted, and then you can start working through that process. But yeah, it varies. I couldn't say I could put a time frame on it, and difference between adults and kids, it's the same, really. If you've got good engagement, you can progress things a lot quicker.
Yep. And Sean, I'd be interested to know, what are some of the strategies that you'd use to, I guess, build that relationship with your clients that you're seeing?
So as the clinician, I went out with one of the health workers, and I went out, the health workers were accompanying me. Actually, it was a population health focus, really, because we got the population list. We looked at each community. We understood, okay, who was in the community. We then went through male, female. We went where they lived, who was still on the island, or who was in the community. Then the health worker went out, I went out, I spoke, the health worker spoke in language, they translated. There were some communities that I couldn't speak Creole because, like in Saibai is, I don't speak that language. So the health workers really were my interpreters at the time. So it was, I think the most important thing to remember, the strategy was what, the communication is the best effective way to engage with the patient, because that was the way I did it. So if you can communicate and build that rapport with your patients and explain to them that, this is what you're doing, the rationale why you're doing it, they're more likely to engage. For an example, we're at one of the islands. I gave one of the appointments to the health worker, and I said, can you go on, give this appointment to the patient. The patient needs to come back and get some bloods done because they've just commenced the medication. I watched the methodology on how this health worker was doing the interaction with the patient. They just dropped the appointment letter off, and then they came back. And everybody at the clinic was saying, this patient will not come in, they're non-compliant, they never turn up. The word non-compliant, they don't turn up. You always hear it across all the health centers. I said to the health worker, you drive, I'll jump out. I said to the patient, you've just commenced lisinopril, we need to do some bloods, X, Y, Z. The patient said, yes, okay. The patient came into the clinic and got their bloods done. Everyone was like, oh my God, the patient turned up. And I said, because you actually explained to the patient.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that.
It sounds simple, but it's important.
It's sometimes missing, isn't it, that why behind we're doing things. It might be second nature to us as health professionals that we might know why we do that and why we do that. But yeah, it's so important, isn't it, that we're really actively involving our patients in the journey of their own healthcare, and that they're understanding why each thing we're doing, why we're doing that, and why that's important and how that will help.
And you're exactly right, because there's no point in saying to somebody, okay, you need to lose 5 kilos in
Yeah.
But how? How do I lose 10 kilos?
Yeah.
Okay, you need to eat 5 serves of vegetables and 2 serves of fruit. Yeah, but where am I going to get that from? I've got to feed large families. Okay, so, and I think that's where we've got to be realistic about, it's got to be a personalized care. A bit like Stuart was saying, it's got to be person-centered, and it's got to be family-centered as also.
Yeah. Did you have anything to add, Stuart, for that one?
No, I think I completely agree. It's about the communication strategy that you have going forward. I often think I do try and make a connection with the individual or family, and that can be just even taking the time to know where someone's come from, or recognizing family country is really important, or the language that they speak at home. And I think family is something I use quite often in terms of engagement, and those family connections are just really important.
Yeah, totally. One of the things that I'm interested to know is, obviously when we're talking about assessing motivation and individual readiness to change, we talk a lot about the individual. And I think that perhaps with some more of our individualistic cultures, which would be traditionally speaking a more Western type approach to health, it is kind of about the individual. And I'd be interested to hear from you both about perhaps traditionally speaking and generally speaking, perhaps more of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures fall into that more collectivist culture. It's more about the family, how that person fits into the community and that family group. What are some of the considerations when we're looking for individual level changes, but how to involve perhaps the family and other people to support that?
I suppose, again, it's a real individual approach, whether how much you're involving family. So especially with adults, you tend to find out who's there to support them and whether they need to be part of the care. I think most people I've come across or worked with, it's often family based. I very rarely that it's just individuals just wanting individual care. I think it's often a collective approach with families. I'm just thinking back to some of the communities. Often, you know, there's groups of sisters that want to work together, but also, you know, with their parents or even with their kids, that people want to make changes. So it's often, yeah, it's very individualized about whether you bring other family members in. It's just asking about who's there to support and if they need to be involved as well.
Got anything to add on that, Sean?
Yeah, I think it's a good point that Stuart made, and the church is also sometimes in these communities play an influential role when talking to a number of people, because a lot of people, especially in the remote, are Christians, and they attend whatever doctrine that or religion that they believe in. That also in my work, that was also what I had to understand and then engage with the church leaders. And when I led the COVID response, especially in Gulawinku here in the Northern Territory, one of the things that I really had to understand was who were the decision makers within the community. So understanding the cultural context, but also the religious context, because there were people who had the cultural power, or the community power in the sense of the tribes and the clan, but then also the understanding who were the religious elders in there, because they also have influential power as well. So I thought religion is an important one.
I'll just add on to that as well. So when we're thinking about young people with type 2 diabetes, a common theme that I hear is, I don't want to be different. And that's what, you know, that's repeatedly been said. So sometimes it's about actually bringing, you know, their peers and their friends into what you're doing. Again, you have to get all the permission, but, you know, I don't want to be different. Then how do we work so that that people are not different, that people are, you know, doing similar things to improve those outcomes?
Yeah, nice. I've got a comment here from Sarah Doherty in the question and answer, saying that the Australian Diabetes Educators Association has a project to get credentialed diabetes educators to mentor diabetes champions in communities. So that sounds like an interesting project that's happening. Yeah, encourage any of the audience to type in some questions in the Q&A box for us to discuss. Stuart, I'm interested to know, I guess, when you're working with someone in the clinic, what are some of the common motivators that people find to help them get them from that kind of maybe contemplative or pre-contemplative stage of change to more towards perhaps contemplating or planning or action?
I think really it's really important to focus on what's important to the individual. Yeah. That doesn't mean that they're going to change any of those behaviors, or, you know, that's the next part you start to work on. Okay, well, you know, why is that so important? Or I think in a previous presentation we had, sometimes people tell you what you want to hear, but I think the follow-up question is always, you know, oh, why is that important? Or why do you want to focus on that now? You know, it's being that curious about what's going on. Because if someone's just telling you something just to please you, there will be no motivation behind it. But if someone is really wanting to make a change in a certain area, there'll be a reason, a why behind it. And you've just got to kind of explore that and see what you can get out. Unfortunately, I don't think we can give people scripts in terms of what you have to say. You really do have to respond to the individual and what's coming out. But I think it's that be curious without being intrusive, and just try and find out some of those reasons.
Yeah, it's challenging, isn't it? Every interaction with a patient's different, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sean, did you have any kind of ways that you might, any questions you might ask to clients to, I guess, find out what's important to them or find those motivators?
Oh, I'm just trying to think. It's been a while since I've provided clinical care now. I've sort of, sorry, it's been a while. I can't.
Yeah, no problem. Maybe Angela, do you have any comment there to add?
I just echo what Stuart said, and really finding the individual motivator, and often it's not what you expect. So for some young people, the motivator might be the presence of acanthosis nigricans, and that can be quite shaming. And sometimes a young person, when you first meet them, comes with a hood on in the heat of like the build up and the top end, and as that can be the motivating factor for them to think about how they might look after their diabetes. And a young person may not at all be necessarily thinking about long-term complications, and that crosses all types of diabetes, not just type 2, but thinking about what's the actual motivator. Sometimes for a young person, it's about their football performance, and if they've got chronic hypoglycemia, how that may negatively impact on their football performance. And so really kind of working out what the motivator is and then trying to build on that. But I'll just share a positive story that I don't know if Holly Catton from Catherine West is on today, but there's, I just suppose, emphasising the importance of that kind of support, and that people may not be in a position to be able to make changes in their life at one point, but they may be at another point, and just that engagement and constant support is really important. So there's a young man that we look after that had really struggled initially with diabetes and lots of things going on in his life, and not really many people in his family that were able to support him with that. But then, and he was struggling at school, and so there's just lots of things that were hard. And then he got a job while he was still doing school, and I think formed a really close relationship with his supervisor in that job. And that really enabled him to make lots of other changes in his life, despite the home situation remaining the same. And so he suddenly was able to take medications, change his food, started playing football, and HbA1c went from being 14%, and over the last 18 months has remained below 6.5%. And I think it's just a really important reminder to us all that to hang in there with some of these young people, and that there's lots of things going on in life, but that people, despite things that are going on in their life, do want to improve their health, and they just have to be supported to be in a position where they may be able to do that. And it may not happen in the timeline that as a health professional you're hoping it happens, but it can happen, and just to continue that relationship with those young people.
That's a great story. Thanks for sharing that, Angela. It's so true, isn't it, that it's they talk about a cycle of change, that it's kind of this dynamic process, isn't it, where we go from sometimes being ready to change, and then making those changes, and then relapsing, and kind of continually finding us at different points of that kind of stages of change. Yeah, and it's a good point you make too, Angela, about our clients and patients might not always be at that stage where they're ready to make changes, but I think it's important that we're always there ready for when they are, and that we never shut the door on anyone to receive care or anything like that if they're not at a stage of change at a particular time. That can change quickly due to other factors in their life, like you outlined in your story.
I think it highlights to me that lots of young people and others with diabetes may really want to make change and they want good health, as Stuart kind of mentioned, but life, lots of things can be going on in life that just makes it impossible to achieve. And it's not because the young person doesn't want it to happen. And so I think we need to be really conscious of that we don't add to the judgment or the sense of failure for a young person, and then we're then the cause of their disengagement with healthcare, rather than acknowledging all the things that may be happening for them in their life.
I just agree with that, because I think one of the things within the self-management model, mistakes happen. And I don't mean like medical mistakes. I mean, individuals will, not get the desired outcome that they are hoping for, or, like you think if they're on insulin, they might one day give them not enough, or they give it up a little bit at a hypo. It's a learning experience. So you learn by doing. And it's you accept that sometimes things aren't going to have the desired outcome that you're hoping for, but you restart and you learn from that experience. So that's the process that we're always trying to go through, is that you learn by doing, and sometimes the best times that you learn are through mistakes, or if you don't actually achieve what you want to achieve.
That's a good point, and I think a lot of our patients tend to normalize diabetes because it becomes hereditary, and everyone's like, okay, I'm going to get it, so it's just normalized. People, obesity, especially in far north Queensland, people just think obesity is normal. You've got that's the way it is. I was just listening to Stuart and Angela, and I was just thinking about some of the stuff, and I looked at the association between depression and glycemic control. I wanted to see if depression actually had an impact on people's self-management, and there was no correlation between the two, because people can put on a mask in front of the community, and then when they're behind closed doors, it's a different scenario. But I guess one of the things is that having that peer support is most importantly, because peer support can help the patient through when you're by yourself, and especially if you're, I mean, I'm no expert in the younger population, but I did spend some time in San Diego at the Behavioral Diabetes Center, and we were working with a lot of the younger people. And sometimes the parents can actually turn them off, because the parents are they're concerned, and they push the child a bit too much, where the child just disengages. And we saw that where the child needs to take control, it's not the parents, and it's not your family that's around you. The individual needs to take control, because as an individual, if somebody's constantly in your ear and telling you can't do this, you just disengage. So I think you've got to let that person lead it, and I think it's a message to parents as well, is to let the child and let that person actually lead and take control of their diabetes, because if they don't, they're just going to disengage.